Okay guys, Brent Hull Wednesday design video. Gonna slow it down and kind of look at it, just a typical door surround and kind of how to make it better. This is my brother-in-law's house. I showed you that it was kind of that A-Haze town looking thing. And we're gonna take what he had there. Remember, he bought this house. I'm not making fun of him. He has some things in this house that allow us to make some liberties. You know, this is what the front door was, okay? So, you know, maybe I should have titled this video, you know, why I never use pre-carved corbels, right? This is what he was dealing with. Now, I've never used this, okay? I've never used a pre-carved corbel like that. Why? Partly because there really isn't a place for them. And I see these things on islands, you know, especially in kitchens when they're trying to goop it up, when they're trying to make it, you know, more impressive. This ends up being a real lazy way of designing. And hey, I want it fancy. Well, let's put something carved in there. And so you end up with, you know, these blocks everywhere, and they were apparently all over his house as a designer's way of kind of making it fancy, right? Or a builder's way of saying, well, you want carved, you want, you know, something fancy, let's put some carved things in there. And so you go to the Inca Ball or whatever they're coming from China, you know, catalog, and you pick 3 or 4 of these things, and they end up looking, you know, bad. They look cheap. And so this, you know, what we're doing is essentially drawing a classical element, a classical entablature over top of this door, right? So now we are elevating the front door quite a bit using a door header or an entablature. Now, the other thing that happened is when I sent my brother, you know, these sketches, okay, and I was showing him, I said, hey, this is what you ought to do. He showed it to his molding guy, and his molding guy goes, whoa, yeah, you could never do that. So I was like, wonder why he said that. Wonder why a molding guy who sells moldings would make a comment like that. Because essentially what we're doing is something like this, right? All really that drawing is this, okay? It is, you know, a door casing. We've got a pulvinated frieze and, you know, a header, a cornice, right? And there you can see that cornice is made up of a little bed mold, corona, cimation, right? So it's a pretty easy little thing. So why would the molding guy say, hey, I can't do that? Now, there's a number of things that I'm showing here that I think might look confusing. One is I'm showing it with what's called a pulvinated frieze. So you can have a frieze that's flat, right? You can have a frieze that's pulvinated, okay? But this is a kind of an S-shaped pulvinated frieze, whereas this one kind of has a rounded one and that one's flat. So the frieze can be a number of different things. Maybe that's confused him. And so I said, well, send me the catalogs and let me kind of pick them out. So he sent me his catalog. He sent me 3 of them. Funny enough, I couldn't find a molding that works, okay? And then I began to realize that why I designed the Kuchen and the Windsor molding lines is because a lot of the moldings all start to look the same, and they all start to be too gumped up, too goopy. And then I saw this picture, right? Dreaming of that new look, right? And so this is the molding guy's dream, okay? So he wants you to do this house, right? He wants you to order every molding in his catalog so you can do, you know, beams and stairs and paneled walls and all the different things that are going on in here. I don't want you to do this, right? I think this is McMansion-y. It's just throwing stuff to throw stuff at it. And so realize that there's already a disconnect between what molding companies want you to order. They want you to make a big order, okay, and what you really need. Maybe it's like going to McDonald's and they want you to order every item on the menu and you really just want, you know, a cheeseburger. And I'm not advocating going to McDonald's, by the way. So you realize that there's a disconnect already just right there. So then I looked at the crowns, okay? And, you know, this was their selection of crowns, okay? The 8011, 8010, 8014, 8009, 8012, those all come from the early catalogs from the turn of the century. All these later ones are not part of that catalog. And so the 8011 and all these are different sizes. And realize that when I grabbed this cornice, my moldings and my bed mold and my crown are small, okay? Notice that, you know, is probably in height is maybe 2 inches, okay? Not very big, and this one's probably like 1.5 inches. So my bed mold and my cimation, okay, corona's here, this is your full cornice. is small, okay? Now, I go back to the catalog and immediately I've got a problem because all their moldings are too big, okay? So essentially what they're showing me is if I go to the 8009, the smallest crown they've got is 3 5/8, okay? So that's a big crown. And at my master builder class, we took guys through laying out the orders, laying out the classical system and talking about the different sizes of moldings. And it became very clear that in a classical sense, the cimation and crown are, cimation and bed mold, sorry, are much smaller than what's available in the catalogs today. They're much more appropriate to maybe a piece of furniture today than they are to a room. And so realize our moldings have gotten big. And here's why, is because a trim carpenter or builder maybe would much rather you put one single crown in there that makes it look like you've got a bunch of built up crowns. And so they offer these crowns, and that DW58 is 5 5/8 inches wide. So it's just this ginormous crown. Now, the problem is if you do the proportions and you do the scale of everything of how it lays out, that's the size of crown that would go on the outside of a 2-story house. Okay, so if the classical system's laid out according to these human proportions, and my hands are proportionate to the rest of my body, these moldings are proportionate to the outside of a house, not the inside of a house, not a 9-foot or 10-foot room. So the crowns are too big. The reason they've got this huge crown over top of that thing, because probably they couldn't find smaller crowns. So there's the first problem, is I couldn't find crowns that could make this thing work. And so I actually hooked my brother up with Richard, who you guys know from the podcast and everything else. And he's actually going to do the project because I showed it to Richard and I said, you can do this for me. Most other trim carpenters can't. In fact, the molding catalog guy can't even get him the moldings that would make that work. So first problem is the crowns are no good. Second problem is casings, okay? And so these are the door and window casings that they've got in their catalog. And so for my openings here, there is a relationship between the size of the opening and the size of the door casing. It's called punctuation. And I need a door casing that's wide enough to frame this opening, to punctuate it, to establish it. And that's really what this does. This is an important opening at the front of the house. The front door, maybe the most important door, it should be elevated. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the relationship is like a 1 to 6, 1 to 8 relationship. So the size of the door, and if a 1 to 6 relationship would have a 6-inch door casing, 1 to 8 relationship would have about a 4.5-inch door casing. So, you know, a pretty big door casing should go around here. Well, I'm looking in this catalog, that's 2 1/8, that's 2 1/4, that's 3 1/2. To find a 5 or 6-inch door casing is really hard. Isn't it ironic that I can't find smaller crowns, but I can't find a bigger casing, right? And so the crowns are too big, the casings are too small. And so the other problem is that they're all so busy. This C22, which is a very popular pattern around here, is this thing that got in a car wreck. I mean, there's just bumps and bruises and cuts and nicks all over that thing. It's just a mess. I'm just looking for a beaded casing, right? Something here, and then a back band, right? So something flat and put a back band on the back. Now I can find a back band. I could probably find a piece of 1x and make that work. The other way to do it is actually if you go to the Kuken or the Windsor catalogs, there's actually 3-step moldings that kind of more traditional, like a classical door casing might look like this. They have a little back band, might be a little bit of a thing, and then it'll be a step, and then there's oftentimes a bead there. So now I've kind of drawn it standing up. That's this 3-step, 1, 2, and then 3, right? Kind of that, you know, in the classical system, there's 3 all over the place: pedestal, column, entablature. You know, cornice has a bed mold, corona, cimation. So you get these 3s going on. This, you know, in here, try to shade it for you so you can see what I'm looking at, right? So there's our kind of a typical 3-step casing. We've got something a little bit more simplified, but that's in the classical sense what that looks like. There is nothing classical in those catalogs. It's just the car wreck, right? It's the car wreck molding that is hard to read. It's meant to be impressive. It's meant to be showy, and yet it's doing the exact opposite because you can't read it. You don't really know what you're looking at. It's not very big and very wide. And so, you know, this irony here that I can't get a big enough door casing, but I can't find a small enough crown to make this thing up, shows the kind of the problem that we've got with kind of design right now, where the lazy person throwing this corbel in there to make it look like they've done something fancy, where really it's just lazy and they're not really thinking through how to make it beautiful. So, you know, look, you don't have to have this little sweep going up at the top. You know, it can just be this, you know, just like the top of this, right? It could be, you know, there's your top of your door, and what I've done is I've sweeped up so that I've connected the window above with the door. But you don't need to do that. You can just have an elevated header, right, with this pulvinated frieze over top of this door. So the other reason, just, you know, philosophically, is that A-Hayes Town would never have had a carved corbel in that style of house. And so even if you think about the style of the house and what was going on there, it doesn't belong. So, you know, I like the header system because it allows me to put this kind of system here, and then when we go to the outside, we do the same kind of situation. This one has cross-headed corners, right? And I've elevated this opening with the classical frieze. This one just goes up right to the bottom of the ceiling. Now, the inside and the outside are speaking to one another. So good details and good things, you know, but just by following this classical rule book really can make a big difference.